Nei rā te reo pōwhiri o te reo tāta ki tēnā koutou katoa. This week, the Royal Commission of Inquiry laid bare the horrific failure of the state and faith-based institutions to protect Aotearoa's most vulnerable. It found that at least 200,000 people have been abused and even more neglected in institutions since 1950. And the state failed to respond to systemic abuse and neglect. Māori bore the brunt of that abuse. Māori were more likely to be taken into care and then faced harsher treatment in that so-called care. And as Labour leader Chris Hipkins said in the House, abuse in state care is still not over. Cross-party support has been pledged to change the system and attempt to restore justice, and Prime Minister Christopher Luxon will issue a formal apology on November 12. But it's a long and expensive road ahead, one already pitted with distrust and the decimation of too many people. Labour leader Chris Hipkins has addressed the state of the Māori-Crown relationship in a speech yesterday, and he joins us now. It's good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in. So how do you characterise that relationship at the moment?
I think it's quite fraught at the moment. I think overall, we've seen a really concerted effort over the last 30 or 40 years to improve the relationship between the Crown and Māori and between non-Māori and Māori. And it feels to me right at the moment like we're going backwards in that regard. And that's the first time that I think I've seen in my lifetime a government in New Zealand that actively seems to be trying to take us backwards rather than forwards when it comes to that relationship.
So when you consider Labour's tenure before National, that run-up, how much responsibility do you take for the relationship as it stands now?
I think we have to acknowledge that we probably didn't explain some of the things that we were doing or set out clearly enough the case for what we were doing. So I think about things like Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, for example. And I think that there were some non-Māori in New Zealand who thought that by having a Māori Health Authority that meant that improving health outcomes for Māori was going to be at their expense, that somehow they were going to miss out on healthcare, that it was going to result in worse healthcare for them, which of course was never going to be the case.
So not a great sales pitch.
But I don't think we explained that enough. I don't think we provided enough reassurance there. But I don't think that's an excuse for the current government to then roll it back. I think that's a reason why maybe taking a pause and saying, let's make sure that people feel comfortable about this would have been a better way of approaching it.
So the truth is that no government of any stripe has really, truly delivered for Māori and delivered justice. And I want to talk about the Marine and Coastal Area Act soon, but let's start with the abuse and care inquiry report. The Commission report came out this week. Shocking read. We've just heard 200,000 people abused in care between 1950 and 1999. What particularly stood out for you in the report?
I'm still working my way through the report. I want to do the victims, or the survivors of abuse in state care, the justice of actually reading the report properly. But every time I pick it up, and it's a substantial report, every time I pick it up and read a bit more, I find it really hard going. It's not something that you can just skim over. It's something that you really get engrossed in, because the abuses were so significant, so systemic. And the fight to have that abuse recognised and even acknowledged that it happened has been such a long one. And along the way, it's been so disrupted. And I think we all need to acknowledge, both even current politicians and those in the past, that we didn't do enough, that we whilst we may have taken some steps forward, often they were accompanied by steps sideways or even in some cases steps backwards.
Well, yeah, you said and you're saying now Labour didn't do enough, and this has been echoed by the commissioners who say that Labour didn't implement its redress recommendations from the interim report He Purapura Ora, He Mara Tipu, which you received in 2021. So what happened there?
We did several things. One is we did set up a group of survivors to work with us to implement those recommendations. We didn't want to simply say, right, we're going to impose a new redress system. We wanted to make sure that the voice of the survivors was heard through that.
Do you feel that you delivered on that front to the magnitude that you would have liked to?
No, absolutely not. And let me be very upfront about that. We wanted to be in a position where we could have the new redress system co-designed with survivors, ready to go when the Royal Commission presented its final report, which of course was supposed to be more than a year ago now. That was delayed. The implementation of the redress was delayed. And I think for the survivors, that kind of just compounded their negative experiences. It was like they were continuing to fight. And so I acknowledge that as one of the ministers involved in that process.
What holds these things up?
I mean, the Royal Commission itself, I think, found the whole process a lot more time-consuming and a lot more complex than they had envisaged when they started, or that we had envisaged as a government. But I think it was really important that we did take the time to do that properly. The redress system, I've said to the current government, we didn't get there. I think it's really important that they do, and we will work with them to support that, so that people know that the redress system is locked in then, and it's not going to change if there's a change of government, that actually we can get some progress.
Yeah, that is reassuring. It's going to cost billions to make people whole, and compensation, recognition of lost potential and wraparound services. The Commission has made 138 recommendations, including a ministry for the care system. So when you look at the recommendations, I hear that you might not have got through them all yet, but when you look at those recommendations through the lens of being potentially Prime Minister, can and should they all be implemented?
Well, one of the things we've got to work through is how. So it's not so much I think that question of can they all be implemented is one of the questions we've got to work through. So what are the practical implications of that, and how would you get from here to there? When people talk about things like, wanting to abolish oranga tamariki, for example, I think we all acknowledge there's huge shortcomings in the way oranga tamariki operates, but you can't just turn the key and stop doing that. Whatever we do, there will be a significant transition to whatever new system we come up with.
Does it feel like it's going to be painful going through that transition?
It's not going to be easy, because we're talking about people here. We're talking about vulnerable people. And I should also, I think we must not lose sight of the fact that there are people, amazing people, providing care to vulnerable children now who I am in awe of in terms of what they do to support some of our most vulnerable people. And one of the things that I always worry about when we see abuse in state care reports is that I would hate for the people who are mopping up the damage of that to feel like that's a reflection on them, because we've got amazing foster parents, for example, who just do such good work.
Yeah,
but the system is broken, and we have to acknowledge that the system is broken.
Should there be prosecutions?
I think that's something that will have to be considered. In many cases, it would be very difficult to mount a prosecution because of the time lapse, because of the lack of evidence. We've seen examples where evidence has been destroyed, for example.
Exactly. But you say abuse in state care still it's not over. So it's not all historic.
No, and I think that is really important to acknowledge that there are contemporary examples now. I mean, you only have to watch the news and see some of the abuse that we're seeing of young people, vulnerable young people now, to know that we've got more work to do. And there are ongoing failures.
Prosecutions should happen.
Let's be upfront about the fact that there are ongoing failures. I think one of the things about the redress system, which we've got to work, is the balance between just getting on with the redress, acknowledging that it happened, versus prosecution, where you have to go through the whole other process of proving that something has happened when you've already acknowledged that it happened.
Yeah.
I think that's the balance that we have to work through.
Okay, there'll be some heads rolling though at some point.
Oh, I think there need to be changes. There need to be major changes.
Yeah. An interesting challenge for the national government, and the report says all entities must comply with the rights of Māori in care by upholding te tiriti o Waitangi. So given that you've offered cross-party support, what would upholding te tiriti look like?
Well, I think if we go back and look at what the report's saying, let's look at the abuse that they're chronicling. They're talking about Māori kids being taken away from their whānau, taken away from their whakapapa, completely removed from their culture, their identity, their sense of who they are, and then abused. We've got to have a different way of doing this. We've got to have a way that still recognises Māori kids' culture and identity, their connection to whakapapa. If they're being removed from a situation where they were being abused, let's make sure that we don't then compound that by putting them in a situation which they should not be put in the first place. Let's make sure that we're acting in a culturally appropriate way when we're dealing with these very, very vulnerable young children.
Okay, so we've talked about te tiriti and the fact that National wants to pull out some of those references. What does that mean in terms of obstacles to solving these problems with a cross-party support system?
Well, I think there are some clear examples of current government activity which I think are very inconsistent with what the Royal Commission have found that actually take us backwards in that regard. So let's talk about boot camps, because I think that's one of the most glaring examples. The Royal Commission's report when it comes to the abuse at boot camps, anybody who read that would not think that boot camps are the answer, ever. And even though the government is saying, oh, well, look, we can do them without there being abuse in the way that there was in the past, the model's still fundamentally flawed. It's doubling down on a system that's broken. It's doubling down on an approach that is wrong. So we shouldn't be going down the road of boot camps. We also shouldn't shy away from the progress we've made in acknowledging Te Treaty, acknowledging the fact that what we're dealing with today is on the back of 180 odd years worth of not honouring the commitments that were made when the treaty was signed.
I want to talk to you now about taku tai moana. So in 2004, Foreshore and seabed, Labour removes Māori customary right to claim title. 2011, National reinstates that right with the Marine and Coastal Act, subject to Māori proving undisturbed and exclusive possession, a very high test. Last year, the Court of Appeal ruled that Māori could claim title if it could be proven that rights of exclusivity had been broken by, for example, raupatu. And this week, National said it will amend the Act to confirm that if the land was lost, it was lost. You can't claim title on the basis of raupatu. What's your reaction? I
think let's start from the very beginning. We didn't get that right in 2004. I think the whole country now knows what happened after that. You know, there was a huge backlash to that. So
actually, let's pause there for a moment. When you reflect on that, how do you feel about it?
I wasn't a parliamentarian then, so...
But you lead Labour, so you own its history. So when you look at that moment in time, which has essentially led us to this moment, what's your reflection?
I think it was really difficult for the Labour government of the day. It was a very difficult issue there. It was being used already as a wedge to divide the country. You know, you had the National Party with billboards up around the country saying no special deals, the beaches are for everyone. And I think the government of the day felt a huge amount of pressure to respond to that.
But caved in an unfortunate way.
And then ultimately didn't get it right.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, let's acknowledge that. But I don't think that this decision is the right one either. I don't think necessarily that the national government's solution after the 2008 election was necessarily the right answer either. But I do remember them at the time saying Māori should have their day in court. Māori deserve their day in court. And now they're legislating to take that away from them again. And I don't think that's the right way forward. I also think, you know, we really need the government now to explain what the law is as it stands and what the implications of that are.
They could argue that that's exactly what they're doing by amending the Act.
Well, there's a lot of non-Māori New Zealanders who think the law as it stands means that Māori are going to have ownership of the beaches and be able to exclude people from them. That isn't what customary title is. And I think at the very least the government should be explaining that to them.
So what is the answer? Should all the foreshore be accessible to the public, no matter the ownership structure, whether that's Māori, non-Māori? I
think so, but I have not seen any Māori in claiming customary title who are wanting to exclude other people from being able to access the beach. In fact, you know, I've seen Māori going the other way. They want to actually make sure that these spaces are more available to everybody and that we can all, you know, enjoy the benefits that come from them. So again, I just think that the dog whistle racism that we see in some of this debate is just so unhelpful. If the government just took a deep breath and explained to New Zealanders what the issue is here, what the courts have ruled, what customary title actually is, I think a lot of this would calm down.
So, but what does that mean though? So sure, Māori do allow access, that's great, but if non-Māori expected to provide access. Is that the right answer? Sure, you own the beach, but you've got to make it accessible to everybody.
I mean, I think, you know, I grew up in an era where we had this idea of the Queen's chain, you know, which is that even if your property touches the water, that actually you should still have a period, you know, you should still make that bit right along the water's edge available to the rest of the public.
Yeah.
I used to walk alongside the Waifatu stream where there were houses that backed onto the Waifatu stream, but people through their backyards still had a section of their backyards that the public could walk through to connect to the waterway. So should that be the case
across the country? It doesn't matter what you think you own, I mean, actually it should be accessible.
I think I'm very reluctant to kind of just draw an arbitrary line on that, but I think that should be the starting point.
Why not?
Well, that should be the starting point, because in some cases people's homes actually literally touch the water, and that's going to be a little bit challenging.
Okay, so where it's practical and logical.
But the basic sort of premise should be, yes, we should have access to the waterways.
Okay. You lost some senior Māori MPs at the last election. How is the recruitment going for the next election?
It's looking very good. You know, we've seen a real interest, actually, and be upfront about this again. I've been in opposition before, and sometimes people go, well, why would I stand for a party that's just lost an election? That's not what we're finding at the moment. In fact, we're finding, probably because of the actions of this government, that there's a lot of Māori who are very energised and enthusiastic about putting their names forward, and there's a lot of non-Māori who want to join us as well. So I think we're going to have a really, an abundance of talent as we start our candidate selection process for next time.
What will you offer them in terms of equity? What's the story that you'll be telling your potential Māori MPs? I
think for our potential Māori MPs, the message is a pretty clear one. I think Māori deserve a voice at the table where the decisions are made. And, if I look at our last cabinet, we saw Māori right at the top table in senior positions, making decisions, and I think that we need to see that continue.
So in your speech, you talk about treaty settlements, that they should be honoured, not necessarily settled. What does a functioning treaty relationship look like to you?
I think we need to, I look forward to the day where we're past the treaty settlement process, where the historical grievances have been resolved, and we're now then much more focused on the contemporary relationship, on making sure that we're all thriving in this country. And that means recognising that when the Māori economy is thriving, when Māori are thriving, that the rest of us are going to benefit from that. That's already
the case.
It's already the case, absolutely. But here's a demographic change to our population that I think non-Māori need to think about. At the moment, the ratio of Māori versus non-Māori in the workforce is going to change hugely in the next 20 years. As middle-aged non-Māori New Zealanders like me think about our retirement, we should reflect on the fact that we need all people in New Zealand to be thriving, to pay for our superannuation and to pay for the healthcare that we're going to want when we retire.
Does this also mean that it may not matter so much what policy is laid out, because eventually the Māori population is going to grow so much that it's going to be forced to be amended?
It's already happening. I mean, I think that, we're edging up close to 1 million Māori New Zealanders now. That demographic change is only going to continue to grow.
I want to return just briefly to the first part of our kōrero this morning, where we talked about the abuse in care report. You mentioned that, we were talking about it earlier, that you felt quite emotional during that speech. What were you thinking?
I was thinking, I'm a dad, I was thinking, how could we have allowed this to happen to children? The fact that it happened in the first place, the fact that those children so vulnerable then tried to do something about it and were just constantly ignored, not believed, that where evidence was produced that it was then covered up, in some cases destroyed. How could we have allowed that to happen? And how could we today still be in a slight state of denial in some cases about the fact that there's still abuse in state care happening right now?
Yeah.
And, I don't want to overly politicise the debate, but I was sitting in Parliament last week and thinking, there are people up here saying, we didn't believe that this could happen in New Zealand. And I was thinking, where have you been for the last 40 years? Because
it's happening right.
Throughout my life, there has been enough evidence to know that things haven't been right.
Yeah. And so when we talked about prosecutions, and you agreed that that might have to be something that is looked at and that heads may roll, who specifically should we be looking at? What should we look at?
I think we've got to change the system, and I think, but I also think as we look to change the system for the future, it's important that we embrace that as a positive opportunity, because the last thing we want is people digging in and trying to, to defend themselves when they haven't necessarily done anything wrong.
So prosecutions are a possibility, but maybe we don't approach the individual. We're looking at maybe agencies?
As I said, there's a balance here. We've admitted that this happened.
Yeah.
We have acknowledged it. We have said we believe the survivors. And so talk of prosecution means you effectively go through the process of proving it all again. We've already admitted that this happened. So the idea of going to redress, I think, is really important.
Do you feel that there is genuine intent from all sides to make the change that's necessary?
I think so, yes. Although, having said that, I still think that there's a lack of acknowledgement on the part of some that some of the contemporary practices, some of today's debate...
You're talking about National now?
The government side of the House, that some of the things that they are doing now is actually going in the opposite direction. Reintroducing boot camps goes in the opposite direction. Removing references to the treaty from Oranga Tamariki legislation, it's going in the opposite direction.
So let's say in the next election, Labor comes in How are you going to solve this? What's going to be your priority?
Well, I hope that before then we will have the redress system sorted. And I've said that we will work with the current government to make sure that redress system is sorted as a matter of priority. In terms of working through the Royal Commission's recommendations around what a better system for state care or state-sponsored care of vulnerable children should look like, I'm not going to start drawing lines in the sand about that until we've actually worked through that report properly and worked through the ins and outs of it. So
if Labor comes into government, do we return to how Labor was governing before National, or have you moved on?
Oh, no, I mean, I think I'm very proud of a lot of the progress that we made. The establishment of Te Aka Whai Ora, the Māori Health Authority, as I said, I don't think we provided enough reassurance to non-Māori New Zealanders, but I still think that was the right thing to do. The establishment of Māori wards on local councils, which the current government have just been disestablishing this week, I still think that was the right thing to do, bearing in mind that what we were doing there was removing discrimination against Māori wards. The current government are treating Māori wards separately to any other wards. A local council can establish a rural ward. That doesn't have to be subject to a referendum, but they're saying a Māori ward should be subject to a referendum. Why the discrimination? So I still think that a lot of those things that we were doing were the right things to do.
We have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Labor leader Chris Hipkins.
Thank you.
It's been a big week in American politics, and as we know, what happens there often impacts here.
I believe it's in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down.
He is dropping out of the 2024 presidential race.
After months of pressure from his own party, Joe Biden has withdrawn his candidacy.
I'd like to thank our great Vice President Kamala Harris. She's experienced, she's tough, she's capable. She's been an incredible partner to me and a leader for our country.
We start tonight with Kamala Harris holding her first campaign rally as the new de facto Democratic nominee.
Kamala Harris riding a wave of newfound optimism in the Democratic Party.
Sarah Smith, Norte Nota, lives in New York with her whānau and votes in US elections. She sat down with Holly Beckham.
Do you think America is ready for Kamala Harris? I actually was personally wanting Kamala Harris to run in 2020. And naively was like, that would be amazing. And a good friend and mentor was like, America's not ready. And I was a little taken aback, a little disappointed. I was like, really, why? No, come on. Then I thought about it, and absolutely, America wasn't ready. I believe America's ready. Yeah. There have been too many significant decisions at the Supreme Court level that have been made in the last couple of years as a result of Trump's Supreme Court appointees, and they're around reproductive rights and they're around affirmative action. And those two things Kamala represents, being a black woman, being a South Asian woman. I can feel the excitement in her announcement. It's only been, a few days. I think her fundraising has proven that people are excited. And I think that there are enough people, voters in the United States, who know that the alternative is just not an option. And that is really the truth. And it's not just the truth for the United States, it's the truth for Aotearoa, it's the truth for the world.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Do you think she'll gain the most traction?
I have already seen that she is getting a lot of traction from black men, black women, women of colour, South Asian women. I saw a campaign this morning for white women, for Kamala Harris. And that is crucial because 47% of white women voted in Trump. And so it's a critical demographic that the party needs to go after. And frankly speaking, white women voted in Trump and it has not come out in favour of all women's rights. When we look at what's happened with the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade being stricken down, and also affirmative action being stricken down, which helps to correct the course of racial inequity in the United States in higher education. So these are really crucial historical decisions that have come through the Supreme Court as a result of the Supreme Court justices that were appointed by the then President Trump, 3 of whom were appointed in his administration, that were all against reproductive rights, abortion rights, affirmative action. So it's not only crucial that white voters get behind Kamala Harris, it's essential, especially for white women voters.
Why should we care about American politics?
We have to care about American politics. It's huge. So just the fact that it's another country, most New Zealanders don't have to have voting rights there, you should be concerned. We trade with the United States, we travel around the world, we have relationships. We do have historical connections with the United States too. And the reality is that they are a huge player on the world stage that has a lot of influence, and that will trickle down, or not trickle down, but that will impact us. And that will impact democracy, and we can't have the rolling back of the rights that our forebears have been fighting for decades and generations. Similar kaupapa. And so we should be concerned. And we should be concerned that, guess what, some of those policies that are in place that disenfranchise communities of colour and Indigenous people in the United States also are the same policies and practices that disenfranchise Māori and marginalised communities here in Aotearoa.
Kia ora, Holly Korua ko Sarah, mihi atu nei. He tina ki runga he tā more ki raro kia ora koutou katoa. That's Marae for this week. The team will be back with you next Sunday. Kia hau maru te noho, hei tērā wiki. Ko te reo, te take.